All right, so the next section we're going to talk about is what we call slavery by another name, this is taken from this a really fantastic book written by Douglas Blackman, who basically wrote this book about how um, slavery was outlawed, but then it never really went away. It was just it was reformed. It was just kind of turned into different versions of, of slavery, like sharecropping, convict leasing, black codes, vagrancy laws, all these different things that basically maintained black people as exploited labor. Yeah, and very similar, and sometimes even worse. Some of these systems were even worse well, when it comes to like mortality rates and conditions were even worse than actual slavery. So we're going to kind of talk about some of these and how that is in this next section. So the first thing we need to, so the first thing if we go back to presidential Reconstruction, when Lincoln was just assassinated and Johnson took over and was basically just forgave all the Confederates and returned them to power, and they immediately started passing laws disenfranchising and oppressing black people and finding new ways to keep them enslaved. Because you have to remember, like the whole entire Southern economy is based on exploiting black people. Like if you just suddenly remove that, there was a lot of fear. There was a lot of plantations, and that were white people were worried about how they were going to continue, these economic systems without exploiting black people. So instead of trying to figure that out, they just decided to figure out new ways to exploit black people. And the first thing they did immediately, the Civil War ended, in early in 1865. So immediately, once Johnson returned all the Confederates back to power, and they immediately passed what was called black codes. And black codes were basically just like all kinds of laws. I mean, all the different states had different black codes, but they're essentially just laws that remove black people's rights to vote, to serve on juries, to testify, to leave, to work anywhere but farms, to own a gun, to gather and worship. I mean, it just outlawed the majority of basic black life. They couldn't work anywhere, they couldn't live anywhere but sharecropping, and if with the ultimate goal, it was a force to be people back into these sharecropping systems, which was basically debt peonage, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And if people refused, they had what was called vagrancy laws, where basically these came about. The first vagrancy laws were created in the rise of capitalism. We talked about these in the last class in Europe in the 1600s, which are just laws that where people refused to work in these horrific factories that industrial revolution factories, so they were maybe beggars or vagabonds or things like that, and so there are always laws passed saying that if you didn't do that, if you didn't work in these factories, we're going to arrest you, send them to these workhouses that force them to work in factories for free. So very similar. That was the same idea with these vagrancy laws. It was like if black people refused to return to their old plantations and become sharecroppers, basically working and constantly in debt, basically continuing slavery. If they refuse to do that, there were these vagrancy laws that basically outlaw that people were unemployed or homeless or loitering, refusing, and so they would arrest them. And then they had the convict leasing, system, which we'll talk about in a second. That basically, once they were arrested, they were then leased out to these plantations, and where they were, have to work off their, debt or whatever, the fines that they were issued, and they were worked, harder than most slave systems. On during slavery, you wanted to keep enslaved people, healthy as long as possible because they were profit. With convict leasing, you would get a new batch of people, black people every month. So I mean, it was just horrific conditions. More people died during convict leasing than slavery. It's just awful. We'll talk about that more in a second. But I want to read this from Carol Anderson, White Rage. She does a great job kind of capturing, some of these codes. So she wrote, Mississippi showed the way. In the fall of 1865, the state passed a series of laws targeted and applicable only to African Americans, free and newly emancipated, that undercut any chance of or hope for civil rights rights, economic independence, or even the reestablishment of families that had been ripped apart by slavery. As noted by Du Bois, the notorious black codes were as an astonishing front to emancipation, and made plain and indisputable the attempt on the part of the Southern states to make Negroes slaves in everything but name. The codes required that blacks sign annual labor contracts with plantations, mill, or mine owners. If African Americans refused or could show no proof of gainful employment, they would be charged with vagrancy and put on the auction block, with their labor sold to the highest bidder. The supposed contract has what was beyond binding. It was more like a shackle. For African Americans, were forbidden to seek better wages or working conditions with another employer. No matter how intolerable the working conditions, if they left a plantation, lumber camp, or mine, they would be jailed and auctioned off. They were trapped. Self-sufficiency itself was illegal, as blacks couldn't hold any other employment besides laborer or domestic, unless they had a written consent of the mayor or judge, and were also banned from hunting and fishing, and thus denied the means even to save off hunger. More galling yet was a provision whereby black children who had been sold before the war and hadn't yet reunited with their parents were to be apprenticed off, with the former masters having the first right to their labor. Finally, the penalty of defiance, including insulting gestures and inappropriate behavior, the black codes make clear was a no-holds-barred whipping. Nine of the other former Confederate states quickly copied the black codes. So Mississippi was the first one, but then 9 other Confederate states copied them. And it basically said that, black people were forced to go back to their old plantations, forced to work in these horrific conditions and under debt peonage. And if they tried to negotiate, better wages, or if they tried to leave and find another farm to work at, they would get, arrested and then, leased back out to these farms as convict leasing under even worse conditions. And even their children, we would call them orphans, but in reality, they were just separated from, because of the domestic slave trade, and they hadn't had the chance to find their parents. Well, those, were actually, there was apprenticeship programs that actually forced those kids back into slavery. So if a plantation owner owned that child and then he was freed, all of a sudden that previous enslaver had first right to those children, so they forced the children back onto these plantations to work for free under apprenticeship programs, and where that gave them the right to basically torture and whip these children as well. So it's basically, it's just a complete return to slavery, but just in a different form. So I'm gonna read this. Where most American laws required people to do something criminal before they were arrested, vagrancy laws made it criminal simply to be a certain type of person. And even we saw very similar. We're going to talk about the similarities between the rise of capitalism and overthrow of Reconstruction. But one of the big similarity that we're going to talk about is they even outlawed the commons. They outlawed, the ability for people to, black people to go hunt and fish and live off the land, common areas. They weren't even allowed to do that as well. So there was no self-sufficiency. Part of the way they removed, forced black people back into the plantations and mines, and is they removed any chance of them being able to, be self-sufficient and be able to provide for themselves on their own. So I'm where Splinter did this really great video on the history of loitering, which is basically vagrancy laws, and how they affect, how they're still alive today.
The act of waiting around with no particular purpose is called loitering, and it's what I'm doing now. Loitering may not seem like a big deal, but when you see black people getting arrested for waiting in the Starbucks or choked for selling cigarettes on the corner, you're looking at the racist history of loitering laws at work. Loitering laws have been around for a very long time, but there's a fine line between loitering and just hanging out, which sometimes leads to selective enforcement. In some places, black people are between 3 to 10 times more likely to be arrested for low-level offenses like loitering than their white counterparts. So where did these laws even come from?
Vagrancy laws and loitering come from Victorian England, and then they were imported to the US, but they take full steam and are enacted aggressively in a post-1865 moment.
After the Civil War ended and slavery was abolished, Southern states passed a new set of laws called the Black Codes. These laws severely restricted the newly freed black population. For instance, former slaves were denied the right to vote and the right to serve on juries. They were also forced to sign yearly contracts with their former owners, and if they refused to sign, they risked being beaten or arrested for vagrancy, which basically meant that being unemployed was a crime.
Loitering, breaking curfew, anything that you would find a nearly free population probably engaging in as what would have been considered reasonable activity was deemed illegal and a crime.
These laws set the stage for mass imprisonment of Black people and continue to be used against them well into the 20th century. In 1965, civil rights activist Fred Shuttlesworth was sentenced to 6 months in prison for loitering. His crime? Speaking to friends on the sidewalk during a department store boycott in Birmingham, Alabama. In nearby Montgomery, Martin Luther King Jr. was arrested for loitering while trying to attend a friend's court hearing. And in the late 60s, 2 white women and 2 Black men driving a car in Jacksonville, Florida, were arrested for prowling by auto, a charge that fell under Florida's vagrancy law at the time. The cops denied that race played a role in the arrest, but when the case was brought before the Supreme Court, Justice Harry Blackmun said the 4 were really convicted for racial intermingling. Florida's vagrancy law was then deemed unconstitutional because of its ambiguity. Over time, other city and state loitering laws were also deemed unconstitutional because of how vague they were. In 1999, the Supreme Court found Chicago's gang loitering ordinance unconstitutional. The vaguely worded law allowed police to basically arrest anyone who looked to them like a gang member.
The purpose of the statute, Your Honor, is to allow the police to attack a form of behavior that criminologists know can contribute to crime in the community, which is the intimidating presence of gang members.
But
Something
isn't this actually punishing people for who they are rather than what they've done?
Over the course of 3 years, the gang loitering law had led to about 42,000 arrests of primarily Latinx and Black residents. And this sanctioned discrimination extends to other communities. Loitering laws have been used to racially profile Latinx day laborers and have led to arrests over their immigration status. Even the Department of Homeland Security called out this racist practice in 2015, when Louisiana police officers arrested 2 Honduran men for loitering, then reported them to Border Patrol. The courts have ruled over and over against the use of these laws, yet people of color still find themselves accused and abused in the name of loitering.
All right. So I think that some of the biggest takeaway is like, these laws are unconstitutional. They're found unconstitutional, throughout their entire history. But at the same time, it doesn't stop vagrancy laws from happening, and people are still getting arrested and harassed, even to this day, through different, loose, interpretations of loitering and vagrancy laws. So it's still something that we're still dealing with today. So on top of that, like we talked about, one of the big reasons for black codes and vagrancy laws is to push people back into basically exploited labor and debt peonage. You continue this capitalistic system where enormous amount of wealth is being produced by exploited labor. And that exploited labor came in this form of sharecropping, which was essentially debt peonage. And what sharecropping lasted for about a century. And what essentially was is black people, had no choice. They had no place to live. After the Civil War, they couldn't. They were being, discriminated against for buying their own land, so that and they couldn't work in other jobs, and they could not be, employed. They couldn't be, they had to be employed, or they could be arrested, and then. So they were forced into back into their old plantations. And essentially, these plantation owners were like, "Well, we'll let you use some of this land. You can grow your crops, you can live on it. You could sell those crops, but we're going to take and you can borrow. We'll rent out our tools and things like that. But then in return, we're going to take a huge portion of your crops as profit for basically rent." But the problem was, like, one, they took a huge portion. Oftentimes, two, it was a very corrupt system. All the power was was with the plantation owners, and they were often, they would underweigh things or overweigh things, and essentially they created a system where a majority of people couldn't, they didn't make enough profit to pay off the what was loaned to them for the land and the housing and the tools. So essentially they would go in debt, and then every year they would go more and more in debt, and they basically became, what we call debt slavery is a debt peonage. So Carol Anderson writes in White Rage, fewer than 20% of all sharecroppers ever made a profit at the end of the year, with the rest consigned to ever widening caravan of debt slavery. So that's less than 1/5 of the amount of people in sharecropping actually made an actual profit. Everyone else went into debt and were forced into slavery through debt. And even that profit, even the few people that made profit were, it was barely enough. It was enough to just basically keep them in poverty, which was another form of slavery as well. And then at the same time, there's an incredible amount of power over these people. Like when we start seeing, the civil rights movements, if some of these sharecroppers, started, we're going to talk about Fannie Lou Hamer, later on. There's a sharecropper, and when it's a great example when Black people started getting involved in civil rights movements, they would just be, they would be kicked off of these plantations. And at the same time as well, there was an enormous amount of abuse and rape and wage theft that was occurring as well. And Black people had little recourse because they didn't have rights, especially during Black codes, but also during Jim Crow. They couldn't represent themselves, they didn't have rights to fair trials and couldn't represent themselves and couldn't get on juries. So there was no recourse, and all the police and the sheriffs, were all white as well, and supported these systems. Ta-Nehisi Coates writes, the tools and necessities were advanced against the return of the crop, which was determined by the employer. When farmers were deemed to be in debt, and they often were, the negative balance was then carried over to the next season. A man and woman who protested this arrangement did so at the risk of grave injury or death. Refusing to work meant rest under vagrancy laws and forced labor under the state penal system. And it also meant lynching too. A lot of people who tried to protest or organize were lynched, and there was even massacres when Black sharecroppers, would try to organize unions and things like that. White people would just massacre everyone. We'll talk a little bit about that in the next section. There was a couple of really big massacres around organizing sharecropping. And then on top of that, there was Black codes had what's called youth apprenticeship laws, where many states had, where basically they were saying that Black children who were previously owned by other enslavers, they were under law, they were forced to go back to those people and work. And oftentimes because they were deemed orphans, when in fact, they weren't orphans. They just hadn't had a chance to locate their parents because they were separated from a domestic slave system. So these kids were forced back onto these plantations to work for free, and were also under these programs, enslavers were allowed to punish these kids and whip them and things, if they try to run away or if they try to resist. So again, and we just have a whole new system of slavery that's occurring. And these Black codes, they a lot of them were overturned, during radical Reconstruction. But then once that was overturned, everything went back to Black codes and eventually transformed into Jim Crow. So even though we talk about this only some of these Black codes lasted a couple of years, at the beginning of the Civil War, but once after radical Reconstruction, it was basically the blueprint to continue, and things like sharecropping, continued for the next century. So I'm gonna play this video because a lot of times we sell this idea that sharecropping ended in the early 1900s, and it did not. It went way into the 1960s, pretty horrific conditions. And there's this Vice video about this woman who literally her full-time job is investigating sharecroppers situations in the 50s and 60s. So I'm just gonna play the first bit of this video.
My dad, their whole family was held against their will. If you did leave, they either come get you or have somebody kill you, whatever. Jerry Dawson, he lived around the same place we lived at home. He left, they went and got him, brought him back, carried him right down there from his house, killed him, hung him up in a tree, castorized him, and hung him up right from his house where his children, everybody could see him. I'm pretty sure it's 55, 56 when this happened.
Most of us think that the end of the Civil War in 1865 closed the chapter on slavery in the American South, but that's far from the truth. Over the next 100 years, generations of black Southerners were forced to labor against their will. This new form of slavery happened in the shadows of the first half of the 20th century. And even though civil rights movement began advancing racial equality in the South in the 1950s, these practices continued secretly, making it a difficult history to prove. Today, there's one woman who's dedicated her life to finding this lost history of black identity. She's been called the slavery detective of the South.
We're currently in Louisiana, about to meet Antoinette Harrell, who specializes in finding cases of essentially modern-day slavery. We're really deep in the South right now. It's super swampy and super rural. I was actually born in Boston and moved to Atlanta, Georgia, like early on in my childhood, but I've never been out this far deep into Louisiana. I'm very interested in connecting with Antoinette and learning more about her work. Hello, Antoinette.
Hi.
Nice to meet you.
Pleasure meeting you.
Antoinette was born and raised in Louisiana, and even though she lost her leg to cancer a few years ago, that hasn't slowed her down from what she sees as a mission of justice, tracking down and verifying cases of slavery and abusive labor practices that happened after the Civil War. Sometimes she gets leads from newspaper clippings, old FBI reports, or recorded testimonies, and sometimes she just gets a phone call.
I got scared because I seen how they beat some of the boys. They beat people to death in there.
Mike, I appreciate you not taking this story to the grave with you. I know it hurt. I know it's very painful. And the state of Florida can't pay you all enough. But I'll be in touch with you shortly.
A few of Antoinette's investigations have been used in court cases for reparations, though sometimes the end goal is simply to give people knowledge of their family roots, which for a lot of black Southerners is something that slavery erased.
Let me first tell you how I got started with this. Researching my own family history. My family was held as slaves. Well, in 1863, my family was emancipated. And my family did become sharecroppers. Robert Harrell became a sharecropper under the system of sharecropping. The planter and the newly freed former slaves came into an agreement. I will furnish you with the seeds, with the land, a place to stay. In return, you would give me a portion of the crops. Well, not everyone did the right thing.
Although sharecropping was technically legal, the practice was widely abused by white landowners who used debts to keep African Americans tied to the land that they once worked as slaves. Sharecroppers didn't pay rent, but they didn't own any property, and today, historians agree, sharecropping was just slavery by a different name.
So many former enslaved Africans had nothing. They had no choice. At the end of the year, you owe me. No matter how hard you work, you are told, sorry.
And those cases relate directly to your cases today.
Right, after slavery. These are like 1921, 1930, 1940s to 50s, and some of them to the 60s.
Antoinette's very first case was May Louise Miller, a woman who was held as a slave with her entire family in Mississippi until 1961. Though May passed away in 2014, Antoinette took us to see one of her brothers, Arthur Miller.
May and Arthur being two of the older sisters and brothers, they remember a lot. It took a long time before Arthur really opened up and talked.
We lived on, I don't know what would you call it, but something like a plantation to me. It belonged to several different white people. They all were family, I guess. And you couldn't leave. And if you did leave, they either come get you or have somebody kill you, whatever. That's what happened. They did my mama bad.
What'd they do to your mother?
They just had my mother, the white men. They just do what they wanted to do with them. And I just wasn't big enough to do nothing. If I would have been, I don't know, probably wouldn't be.
And this was in the 1950s or 40s?
That was on through the 40s, in the 50s, all through the 50s, 40s to 60s.
So what would the repercussions be if you tried to leave or if you tried to refuse what they wanted?
Back in them days, it was kind of like you had to do what the white man said or get killed. My daddy's uncle, he made him dig a grave and killed him. Killed him, buried him in his own grave. Jerry Dawson, they killed him. He lived around the same place we lived at home. He left and said he wasn't coming back. They went and got him, brought him back, carried him right down there from his house, killed him, hung him up in a tree.
They hung him?
They killed him first, castorized him, and hung him up right from his house where his children, everybody could see him.
Were you aware that this is 1940s, 1950s, that this is insane. This breaks my heart to hear this story. Growing up, were you fully aware, this is in the 40s and 50s, the civil rights movement is just about to begin. Were you aware of what was going on in the rest of the country at that time for Black people pursuing freedom?
No.
You weren't aware at all that there was any pursuits for freedom in the 40s and 50s for us?
No, not really. Not really, go. I think maybe like in 65, 66, they was doing that marching. That's when I really found out. The people are scared to talk about it. It's people right now y'all go to talk to. They won't talk with y'all about this shit. They're scared to do it. They got that fear in them,
So it's just a glimpse of just how horrific that the sharecropping was and how long it lasted, which we really downplay that part. And then on the other end of sharecropping, let's say if you did refuse, and if you weren't lynched or you weren't killed or you weren't brought back, and you refused to work on sharecropping, they would arrest you under vagrancy laws, and then they would send you, and then you would be basically they would send you through this convict leasing program, where they essentially leased you out to other plantations and mines and lumber yards and things, and they would work them like crazy. This is when people talk about how some systems were even worse than slavery, this is one of them. Because like I said, in slavery, you want, they're investments. Enslaved people are investments you want to keep alive as long as possible. With this, you get a new batch of convicts every month, and people just work them to death. Horrific. If you look at some of the mortality rates, it's just horrific, and in many circumstances, it far exceeded the mortality rates in slavery. So this was made possible by the 13th Amendment, which actually outlawed slavery, but allowed there was a clause that allowed that 13th Amendment, that allowed slavery as a punishment for crime, and that was very intentional. That was written, and it's one of the ways that we continue to enslave people even to this day, is through arresting them and then forcing labor on them. And this system increased in the South after the Civil War. I mean, it was around before the Civil War, but it really blew up right after the Civil War, especially as it went hand in hand with criminalizing, Black lives, and Black codes and Jim Crow and vagrancy laws, where there was just so many ways to arrest Black people for doing nothing, and then forcing them into these convict leasing situations, and they'd be leased out, and they made enormous amount of profits, not just for these plantations and that got really free exploitable labor, but also for local governments who in many ways had troubles even at first. I mean, a lot of these governments could even pay for prisons at this time, and all of a sudden we're making large profits leasing people out and not having to pay for the care of them. They would the leasee, or what the people that the enslavers would have to pay for it. So it actually made a lot of money for a lot of local governments as well, and it created this an incentive to arrest more black people, to create more black codes and Jim Crow laws and vagrancy laws, and to enforce that as much as possible and try to arrest as many black people as possible, because more black people were arrested, the more profit was made. And we see a very similarity today as well, as our prisons are going towards for-profit prisons, as there's a continuation of this profit incentive of the more people are arrested, the more profits these large corporations make. Eventually, convict leasing was outlawed in early 1900s. Like 1927 was the last, convict leasing program that was outlawed in Alabama. And it wasn't because, people realized how horrific it was. It was because there was this progressive movement, when we call this populist progressive movement. It wasn't progressive there. It's not very similar to the progressives today. It's more about how we benefit white laborers, and white farm owners, this was a movement to kind of, they realized that this new slave system was actually a huge competition to free labor, to wage labor. So that's when there was a whole movement to outlaw this, was to kind of stop them from competing against free labor. So Equal Justice Initiative writes, convict leasing demonstrated the way in which the criminal justice system would become the central institution for sustaining racial domination and hierarchy in America. It legitimizes excessive punishment and abuse of African Americans and terrorized people of color. So this is when we start seeing the early foundations of a lot of our criminal justice system was founded off of these racist hierarchies and this criminalization of Black people. And in many ways, we see the same. A lot of this, that was created at this time, we see that still present in our criminal justice system today. And it's just the inhumanity of convict leasing. It's just a horrific system with horrific, punishments. And basically, the state, in order to make as much profit as possible, they everything like the food, clothing, shelter, medicine was all supposed to be done, provided by the people that were receiving these convicts. At the plantations and the mines, the state had they wanted to save as much money as possible, so they provided no funds for that. It was just a simple straight up payment. But then these plantations were operated by horrific people as well, and like they just the food and clothing and shelter, and there was no medical care. It was just they lived in old slave shacks, got terrible food, were whipped repeatedly, were provided very little medical and it was like no state oversight, or I don't even think the state at that time really even cared as well. So we just saw extreme mortality rates and conditions and inhumane systems. Shane Bauer writes, the system was actually more deadly than slavery. Every year, between 16 to 25% of prisoners would die. It was on par with the death rates of the Soviet gulags. And it's just some of the horrifics. Like Alabama was one of the worst places. They had these mines. They were just like a third of the 684 forced laborers in prison at one mine died. In 2 weeks period, 137 floggings were administered to 165 forced laborers. Just horrific conditions, even beyond slavery. And like to the point that people a lot of these people were actually doing self-mutilations, were actually hurting themselves, so they wouldn't be valuable labor that was sold out. It was a pretty horrific situation. Ian Hanny Lopez writes, in slavery's antebellum form, humans as property were at least minimally protected because of their long-term financial value. But under convict leasing, a man's value did not exceed what his employer paid the state monthly. If the laborer died in custody, the employer suffered only trivial financial inconveniences, as another convict could be readily procured at the same tariff. One dies, gets another one, becoming the working model of the system's architects. So we played this, PBS did a special that was kind of based on this book, Slavery by Another Name, with multiple different historians talking. But I'm just going to play a quick section that kind of talks a little bit about, vagrancy laws and black codes, but mainly about convict leasing.
With the end of Reconstruction, The nature of both crime and punishment in the South changed dramatically. State after state and county after county, laws targeted African Americans, effectively criminalized black life. It was a crime in the South for a farm worker to walk beside a railroad. It was a crime in the South to speak loudly in the company of white women. It was a crime to sell the products of your farm after dark.
Anything from spitting or drinking or being found to be drunk in public or loitering in public spaces could result in confinement. So there was an over-exaggeration of African American criminality during this time period. It's not to absolve all prisoners from having committed crimes, but there were many trumped up charges.
One of the most infamous set of laws to come out of this period were the pig laws, passed in Mississippi, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, enhancing penalties for what had been previously misdemeanor offenses to now felony offenses.
In Mississippi, theft of a pig worth as little as $1 could mean 5 years in prison. In Tennessee, hard labor might result from stealing an 8-cent fence rail.
But the most powerful, the most damaging of all of these laws were the vagrancy statutes. In every southern state, you became a criminal if you could not prove at any given moment that you were employed.
Under slavery, most black crime was punished by slaveholders, leaving the courts to discipline whites. Now, only about 10% of those arrested were white.
Now, what does this mean? Does this mean that white people are not committing crimes in the South? We know that's not true.
Southern states had a history of placing prisoners with industries that would bear the cost of guarding and housing them in exchange for their labor. Now, states also began to charge fees, renting prisoners to companies by the month. The highest rates were for the strongest workers and longest sentences.
When you go to the 13th Amendment, one of the fascinating things about the text of that amendment is that it says that slavery is abolished, except in the case of a punishment for a crime. And within that wiggle room, what you see in it is that there's still the possibility of extending slavery, as it were, by another name.
The system was known as convict leasing.
It took time for the system of convict leasing to develop. Time for the state to realize that prisoners, believe it or not, could be a source of profit. Once that revenue starts coming in, they're pleasantly surprised. This is new revenue we never had before.
The state of Alabama earned $14,000 in its first year of convict leasing, 1874. By 1890, revenue was $164,000, roughly $4.1 million today. By then, states throughout the South and hundreds of counties and cities were engaged in some form of leasing convicts to private industry.
And it gave tremendous discretionary power for the private owner, either a landowner or a corporation or a coal mine, could be any business concern, to do what they wanted with that African American.
All right. I definitely recommend. Yeah, I recommend all these documentaries, but this is another great PBS documentary, "The Slavery by Another Name." If you really want to kind of dive deeper into how slavery continued for another century, and in many ways still to this day continues. For example, so convict leasing was this idea of leasing out prisoners for profit to private companies was outlawed in the early 1900s, mainly because it competed too much against free labor and free white labor. But this system essentially, eventually came back. And even during why it was outlawed for a good half century, that didn't prevent states from continuing enslaved labor on public land. So like places like Texas, up until the 1970s, Texas, continued to have, their prisoners pick cottons for free on public cotton lands that they would sell for a profit for the state. And then Mississippi, Louisiana, southern states had all forced agriculture programs. And we even see, remnants of this, still, happens today, like in California. Whenever you see California fires, you see the main people fighting the fires are prisoners who are paid next to nothing. And then and then they're not even allowed to, after they leave prison, they're not even allowed to, they're banned from even becoming a firefighter as well because of the felon charges. So it's so our states still continue to force slave labor up until the 70s. But in around like the 70s, we start seeing this is the return to convict leasing, or at least this return to a system of for-profit prisons, and making money, corporations making money off of prison labor. This really, rises with this organization, this lobby group called the American Legislation Exchange Council, or ALEC, and we're going to talk about them on lots of different sections. We're going to talk about them again about how, in the voter suppression section of this class, and a lot during the mass incarceration class, because they are one of the main actors with the creation of this mass incarceration, because they basically it's a corporation, a lobby group for corporations looking to make a lot of profit, and they find they partner oftentimes with conservative governments and sometimes moderate Democrat governments, and they create these cookie cutter laws. They mainly focus on state laws, and they create these state laws that allow voter suppression to happen and for-profit prisons and things like that. But they help produce a couple of these legislation, like the Prison Industrial Enhancement Certification Program and various different prison industry acts that basically legalize it slowly legalized for-profit prisons, and not only that, but it slowly legalized prisons leasing out prisoners for for-profit or companies as well. It took a while, but and they partnered a lot with like the Reagan administration but eventually we got to the point where we see like a lot of our products today are made by prison labor, from like Microsoft to Apple to all these organizations. They have whole factories in prisons, and there are a few states that they don't pay nothing, pay nothing, and it's virtual slavery. But there are other states that pay like next to nothing, 10 cents an hour or something like that, and then they force them to pay that back through like buying toiletries and super expensive phone calls and things. So it is so the corporations, thanks to ALEC, corporations have been able to continue to make enormous amount of money off of prison labor, and many times prison slave labor. And then this really is one of the biggest factors. And we're going to have a whole section on mass incarceration, but this is one of the biggest factors that leads to our time period mass incarceration. Because not only once they opened up the prisons again for profit, for profits for private industries, Alex starts working with all these state governments to start passing, basically war on drug, crimes. Like mandatory minimums, 3 strikes, truth in sentencing, bills, pushing broken windows policy, stop and frisk, all these, laws that essentially just flooded our prisons with prisoners, disproportionately from Black communities and Black, Indigenous, people of color communities. And that really is what established this rise in mass incarceration, was returning the system of for-profit. I really don't think we would have, there was a lot of other actors as well, like the modern Republican Party and many Democrats like Bill Clinton and what we call New Democrats were like very moderate to conservative Democrats were all focused on winning elections by pushing this fear of Black people, and that we needed to respond to things like like drug epidemics with police responses, and we see this just like this large mass large movement for mass incarceration that we're experiencing even today, where we're and we'll have a whole another class that kind of maps out this history as well. But I just wanted to connect that really quickly to convict leasing, because that is directly that ability to make profit off of prison labor is something that we're still dealing with today, even if it's not called convict leasing anymore. So then the last thing I want to talk about is like the failure of the Freemen Bank. So this was in Reconstruction, the Freemen bureaus, created this banking systems because they realized right away all these free Black people, some of them were making some money, and were making some profits, but most of the banks were white, segregated banks, or if they did find banks, it was super shady, and they were scammed out of their money. So the Freemen bureaus created this, Freemen Savings and Trust, where they created a whole bunch of branches, across the South, where Black people could start depositing their money, and the idea was it was going to be this safe thing, but a place where Black people could take their money. But unfortunately, they put, the board was made up of all these like really awful white people that it's one, a couple of them, would use this money to like, finance their investments, and there was all kinds of scams and corruption, and eventually the bank went under, and nothing was insured. So all these freely new Black depositors, 61,000 Black freedmen, they were starting to make this money. You deposited 3 million, which is equivalent to 63 million today's standard, but which may, on the grand scheme of the things may not seem that much, but for people that are slowly struggling, to get out of slavery, and the realities that they were created outside of slavery, that was an enormous amount of money, and for that bank to basically just collapse on themselves, and for all those Black depositors to lose their money was a huge economic impact as well. All right, and then I went to this last slide because I keep on mentioning. I found, because in the last class I really dived into the history of rise of capitalism in European governments. In the 14, 15, 1600s, and I just found so many similarities between the overthrow and Reconstruction, and I just want to kind of capture it real quickly. Just but I think the most important thing to understand with these similarities is in Europe, and when the rise of capitalism, you had feudalism, you had all these peasants, and then some you had these merchant class and industrial revolution. You had all these factories, and they needed people to work in these factories, but they were such harsh conditions, and in the mines and these larger plantations, that they eventually passed all kinds of laws to outlaw, that they privatized the commons, they kicked people off their land, and then they created like anti-vagabond laws, and to the point where European peasants, they had no other choice but to work in these horrific factories and these horrific mine conditions, and that's really what fueled our industrial revolution and created an enormous amount of wealth, was this exploitation of poor peasants. And I saw very similar, overthrow, Reconstruction, very similar situation where we had slavery and that ended, and now all these white capitalists wanted to continue making a lot of money off of exploitation of Black labor, so they created they outlawed any opportunity for self-sufficiency that Black people had. They outlawed their ability to hunt and fish in the common areas. They outlawed professions that they can work on. They passed vagrancy laws saying that you couldn't just not be employed, and they forced everyone either into debt peonage with sharecropping, or they would arrest them, convict leasing, and then lease them back out to these so they had these two systems that made an enormous amount of wealth basically on exploiting exploiting labor and also removing any other option for that exploited labor. So they had to, become exploited labor. And that's why I saw, very similar, we saw these both, these actions happening in both scenarios. Like a big one, like with European capitalism was like, serfdom. They traded they traded serfdom for like wage labor and rent, which was nice at first, but then all of a sudden the wages went down, everything cost a lot, and then that led to like this mass evictions of peasants that lost their land and had to go to the cities. Same with over for the Reconstruction, they had, we traded slavery for sharecropping and convict leasing and youth apprenticeships. We had enormous amount. Both systems were based on land theft. It was about evictions and privatizations, in Europe, but also in America, it was about preventing Black people from owning land, or if they did own land, finding all these different ways to steal that land. We're gonna have another class. We're gonna talk about the whole history of Black land theft. As well. And then, the loss of commons, Europe enclosed all their common areas, because that used to be like the area that peasants could kind of, when in trouble, they can always hunt and fish, and they can even live off it. There was a lot, there was like tens of thousands of villages on these commons, and all of them were demolished and privatized. And then there's laws like game laws and bloody codes that basically, would pass death sentences for people trying to hunt or fish in the commons. And the same thing happened with slave codes and Black codes, and there's a fence and stock laws that basically prevented Black people from actually providing for themselves on these commons. Carol Anderson wrote like Blacks after Civil War were denied access to land, banned for hunting and fishing, and forbidden to work independently using skills honed and developed while enslaved, such as blacksmithing. Under such conditions, self-sufficiencies never have been achieved, could never be achieved. And then there was, again, there's these laws, outlawing any other options, so people didn't want to participate in these horrific situations, whether it was European factories or sharecropping situations. There was all these laws like anti-vagabond laws, vagrancy laws, Black codes that outlawed that, and then they would arrest them and then then force them to either work in these factories in European capitalism. They were called workhouses or correction houses, and then they would be arrested, sent to those, and then those houses would force them to work in these factories for free. Same with convict leasing as well. And then kind of control this whole system, there's enormous amount of violence. Like in European capitalism, anytime peasants try to resist, through like, food riots and rent strikes and things like that, they were violently, repressed, and that really led to the witch hunts that killed hundreds of thousands of women, because women were main organizers of a lot of these forms of resistance. And then we saw, in Black Reconstruction, very similar. Anyone tried to resist, sharecropping or any of these, Jim Crow laws, were lynched and terrorized by white terrorism. So I just wanted to point out, I saw these two very similarities of the rise of capitalism in Europe and the overthrow of Reconstruction, and I just think it's important to kind of connect the two, because a lot of this is essentially capitalism. Capitalism is basically based on making wealth from exploiting labor, and that was what both of these systems kind of were centered around. So all right, yeah, I wanted to throw that up on the slide just because I thought it's important, at least to recognize.